Greetings, quilters. This is the second half of our Eldon Quilt presentation. In this presentation, we show how to add and miter borders, assemble the back, batting and quilt top, pin the layers together, and do machine quilting and bind the quilt. This is the quilt top ready to be finished. Our next step is to decide on the border. We auditioned different colors, and in this process we decided to use 3 different borders. The dark green color makes a bold contrast to the yellow quilt top and is 3 inches wide. The lavender is not as bold and is 4.5 inches wide. The yellow echoes the quilt top and is 3 inches wide. We add a 1/2 inch for the seam allowance, cut the strips, and sew the strips and cut the lengths needed. We check to make sure the borders overlap the ends of the quilt enough so that we can miter the corner. Before sewing these border strips together, we mark the center of each strip. We match the center lines of the first 2 strips, pin and sew them together. Then we match the center lines of the 3rd strip, pin and sew it, completing the border pieces. We carefully dry iron the seams and then press the seams flat. It is exciting to see it coming together. This is the final check of the border. Now it is time to trim the quilt top, making sure the edges are straight. Mark the center of each side of the quilt top. Match the center marks of the quilt top and the border. Pin these together. Sew the border to the quilt top. To miter the corners, we fold the quilt top so the adjoining edges of the quilt are aligned with each other. We pin the edges of the quilt to keep them aligned. We use the 45-degree line on the cutting mat to intersect the exact corner of the quilt. The 45-degree angle of a ruler could be used as well. Mark the sewing path with a pencil. Check that the seams of both top and bottom pieces match at the intersection of the sewing path. Pin the seams close to the sewing path. Use as many pins as needed. Sew along this line. Remove the pins and verify that the seams match the way you want them to. If it doesn't look correct, pick the seams out and try again. If the mitered seam looks the way you want it to, use your ruler and cut 1/4 inch from the seam. Our quilt top is finished and we are ready to assemble the quilt. We iron the quilt back to make sure that there are no wrinkles. We cut the batting large enough to make sure we have extra on all sides. We lay the quilt top on the quilt back and cut the back so that it is about 2 inches larger on all sides than the quilt top. We set up the quilting frame and begin aligning the quilt back. Mark the center of the quilt back and match it with the center of the quilting frame. Do this for all 4 sides. When thumbtacking the quilt back, make sure the material is face down. Tack the center of the fabric on one side and then the opposite side. Then thumbtack the center of the top and then the bottom. Thumbtack one corner and then the opposite corner. Do the same for the other corners. We lay the batting on the quilt back and smooth out the batting. This is the last chance to check the seams for errors and to iron them in the desired direction. We found 3 seams that needed to be reworked. Center the quilt top on all 4 sides and thumbtack it using the same process as tacking the quilt back to the frame. Gently tension the top and bottom fabric as you tack the quilt to the frame. Tacks should be about 8 inches apart. Begin pinning the quilt with safety pins. Bent quilter pins work best. Pins should be about 6 inches apart. Roll the quilt and pin until the entire quilt is pinned. Remove the quilt from the quilting frame and you are ready to machine quilt. We sew the perimeter of the log cabin blocks and the triangle blocks of the stars. We sew all the way around the outside of the log cabin block. Then stitch around the inside of the log cabin blocks. Then stitch from the inside point of the log cabin block through the center to the point of the opposite log cabin block. We do this to assure all star points are sewn. We sew all other seams using the stitch in the ditch process. We added a little decoration on the triangles as well. While additioning thread for the borders, we decided that the 3-inch border would not need to be quilted. For the 4.5-inch border, we decided to use the diamond template. We measured the length of the diamond and divided that into the length of the border to see how the diamond pattern would fit. Some fudging was needed for each side. We made a template with holes to mark the corners of each diamond. We planned to sew from point to point. Auxiliary lines or marks could be used if needed. Finally, all of the machine quilting is complete. Now it is time to trim the edges of the quilt. We have a large square ruler that helps us square the corners. Just a little trimming on the corners really makes a difference. The quilt edges are trimmed and ready for binding. We made the binding from 2.5-inch strips cut on the bias that we sewed together. We folded the strip in half and ironed it, then wound it on a box end until needed. We pinned the binding to the top side of the quilt with the cut edge of the binding to the cut edge of the quilt. We leave a gap of about 12 inches between the start and finish ends of the binding. We leave about 12 inches of extra binding at both ends to be able to join and finish the binding. Pin the binding about 8 inches apart. Fold the binding with a 45-degree angle to go around the corners. Continue pinning the binding. We have a mark on the walking foot and painter's tape on the tabletop as guides for the seam. This is our setup. The extra tables help hold the weight of the quilt. Sew the seam up to the fold in the binding. Backstitch and end the sewing. Fold the binding back the other way and start sewing on the other side of the fold. Be careful not to sew the folded binding material underneath. The binding should look like this before it is pulled to the other side of the quilt. The ends of the binding must overlap by a 1/2 inch in order to sew the ends together. Cut both ends of the binding at a 45-degree angle. Make sure the angles match each other, making sure you have a 1/2 inch overlap before you cut the excess binding. We pull the quilt together using a clip to hold it while sewing the ends of the binding together. Sew the ends right side together with a 1/4 inch seam and finish sewing the binding. Pull the binding to the back side of the quilt and stitch it with a hem stitch spaced about a 1/4 of an inch apart. It would be nice if all corners looked this good. Now is the time to find all the thread tails and loose threads. The light at an angle makes finding these a lot easier. We have found that a good sharp seam ripper cuts thread tails very easily. Scissors work as well. We make a nameplate for all of our quilts. It's a great final touch. This is the finished quilt. This is how the front and back of the quilt look together. We hope that you have enjoyed our presentation. This is the most complex quilt that we have made, and it was so fun to see it come together. Yes, we made a few mistakes, but that's all part of having fun. Thanks for watching.